At 11:30 a.m. on May 13, 1943, the guns in Tunisia stopped. For months, the North African desert had been a cacophony of 88 flak cannons, the grinding treads of Panzer IV tanks, and the scream of Stuka dive bombers. Now there was only the wind hissing through the scrub and the heat shimmering off the sand. Obergefreiter Corporal Hans Müller stood next to his half-track, his hands raised above his head. He was 22 years old. He was a veteran of the Afrika Corps, one of the most disciplined fighting forces in the Wehrmacht. He had followed the desert fox Erwin Rommel across thousands of miles of burning sand. He had believed in the invincibility of the German army. But Rommel was gone, evacuated to Europe. The fuel was gone. The ammunition was gone. And now, walking out of the shimmering heat haze, were the Americans. Hans was terrified. Not of the battle, he understood battle. He was terrified of what came next. German propaganda had been very clear about what happened to prisoners of war in American hands. They were told the Americans were gangsters, undisciplined cowboys who would likely shoot them out of hand or ship them to work camps that would rival the worst dungeons of the East. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, had painted a picture of American brutality designed to make German soldiers fight to the last bullet. Hans waited for the bullet. He watched an American GI approach, a Thompson submachine gun slung casually over his shoulder. The American was chewing gum. He looked at Hans, looked at the pile of surrendered Mauser rifles, and gestured with his thumb. "That way, Fritz," the American said. There was no bullet. There was no execution. There was only a long, dusty march into captivity. If you want to understand one of the strangest and most forgotten chapters of World War II, a story where enemies became neighbors and fences became optional, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten archives with the world. Subscribe if you haven't already. And do us a favor, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the war. We want to hear your stories. Now, back to 1943. The surrender in Tunisia was a catastrophe for the Third Reich. Over 230,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, a defeat comparable in scale to Stalingrad. For the Allies, it created an immediate logistical nightmare. What do you do with 250,000 angry, well-trained Nazi soldiers? Britain was already overflowing with prisoners. Canada was taking its share, but they were nearing capacity. The solution was the Atlantic Ocean. The United States had the space, it had the food, and it had ships. Hans and thousands of his comrades were herded onto transport trucks. They were stripped of their weapons, their binoculars, and their medals, but they kept their uniforms. They were driven to the ports of North Africa, where the Liberty ships were waiting. The Liberty ship was the workhorse of the American war effort. 441 feet long, welded together in record time, powered by a triple expansion steam engine that chugged like a frantic heart. To Hans, seeing the harbor filled with them was a shock. German U-boats were supposed to be strangling the Allied supply lines. Yet here were hundreds of ships, loading men and material with an efficiency that made the Wehrmacht's logistics look amateur. The boarding process was tense. The German prisoners were packed into the holds. It was cramped, hot, and smelled of diesel and sweat. As the ship cast off and headed for the open Atlantic, a new fear took hold. They were sailing into the hunting grounds of the Kriegsmarine. For the next 2 weeks, the prisoners lived in a state of dark irony. They were German soldiers, praying that German submarines would not find them. If a U-boat torpedoed this Liberty ship, the wolf packs would be killing their own countrymen. The prisoners organized shifts to listen to the hull, terrified of the metallic clang that would signal a torpedo impact. But the torpedo never came. Instead, What came was the first crack in the wall of lies Hans had been fed. It started with the food. On the third day at sea, the prisoners were fed. In the German army by 1943, rations were becoming grim. Black bread that was more sawdust than wheat, synthetic coffee, watery stew. On the American ship, a mess orderly slapped a tray onto the table in front of Hans. It contained white bread, real butter, meat that looked like meat, and an orange. Hans stared at the orange. He hadn't seen fresh citrus in 2 years. He looked at the other prisoners. They were hesitant, suspicious. Was this a trick, a last meal? But the Americans were eating the same thing. The sheer caloric density of the meal was overwhelming. This was the enemy that was supposed to be collapsing. This was the nation that was supposed to be weak. The Atlantic crossing took 20 days. When the ship finally slowed, the prisoners were ordered up to the deck. It was night. Hans climbed the ladder, breathing in the cool, salty air. He looked out toward the horizon, expecting the blackout conditions of Europe, dark cities, fearful of bombers, hidden in shadow. Instead, he saw a galaxy. The skyline of New York City, or perhaps Norfolk, ports varied, but the effect was the same, was blazing with light. Skyscrapers were lit up from bottom to top. Streetlights were on. Cars moved along coastal roads with their headlights beaming. There was no blackout. The psychological impact hit the German prisoners harder than an artillery barrage. In Germany, a single light showing at night could get you arrested or bombed. Here, the Americans didn't care. They were so confident, so untouched by the Luftwaffe, that they left the lights on. It was a display of arrogance and power that no speech could match. Hans felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. The war was not going the way Berlin had said it was. They docked and the processing began. The prisoners were sprayed with DDT to kill lice, fingerprinted, and issued POW identification numbers. But the brutality they expected never materialized. The guards were firm but bored. They didn't scream. They didn't beat them with rifle butts. They simply pointed and gave orders in broken German or through interpreters. Then came the train. The prisoners were loaded onto passenger trains to be moved inland. Again, Hans prepared for cattle cars, the standard method of moving troops and prisoners in Europe. Wooden boxcars, no seats, a bucket in the corner. Instead, he walked into a Pullman coach. It had cushioned seats. It had windows. It had heating. A porter walked through selling snacks. The German officers were sometimes even given access to dining cars. As the train chugged west, leaving the coast behind, the prisoners stared out the windows. They watched the landscape change from the industrial density of the East Coast to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, the flat expanses of the Midwest, the endless cornfields. They traveled for hours, then days. In Europe, if you travel for 2 days, you cross 3 countries. In America, you were still in the same state. The scale of the land was incomprehensible to the Europeans. They saw factory after factory, field after field. They saw rail yards packed with new tanks, new jeeps, new planes. They saw a nation that wasn't just fighting a war, it was mass-producing it. Hans sat next to a Feldwebel sergeant named Karl. Karl was an older man, a veteran of the First World War. He looked out the window at the endless fields of wheat passing by. "We have lost," Karl whispered. He didn't say it with sadness. He said it with the objective calculation of a soldier. "Look at this space. Look at these resources. We are fighting a continent." The train finally slowed on the 4th day. They were deep in the American South, perhaps Mississippi, Alabama, or Texas. The climate was hot, humid, reminding them of the early days in Africa, but green, lush. The train stopped at a siding near a small town. The prisoners were ordered off. They formed up in ranks, their discipline returning automatically. They marched through the town. The American civilians came out to watch. Hans kept his eyes forward, expecting rocks, spit, or insults. He was a Nazi, the enemy, but the crowd was strangely quiet. Curiosity. Some anger, yes, but mostly just staring. These were the monsters they had read about in the papers. They looked just like the boys from the local high school, only tired and wearing field gray. They arrived at the camp gates. Camp Aliceville, or perhaps Camp Hearn. It was a grid of wooden barracks, watchtowers, and high barbed wire fences. It looked like a prison. This was what they expected. This was familiar. Hans was assigned a bunk. He was given a mattress, clean sheets, and a toiletry kit. He tested the mattress. It was soft. That evening, the camp commander, an American colonel, addressed the new arrivals. The interpreter translated his words. "You are prisoners of war," the colonel said. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be fed. You will be housed. You will work. If you obey the rules, you will be treated with respect. If you try to escape, you will be caught." Hans listened. It sounded too simple. Where was the indoctrination? Where was the forced labor in the salt mines? The next morning, the reality of their new life began. And it started with a realization that was even more shocking than the white bread or the lighted cities. Hans was assigned to a work detail. Agriculture. The local farmers were short on labor because all the American men were fighting in Europe. The government had set up a system where POWs could work the fields. They were loaded onto trucks and driven out of the main camp. They drove for 20 minutes until they reached a cotton field. The truck stopped. The prisoners jumped down. Hans looked around for the guards. There was one American soldier. He was sitting on the hood of the truck, his rifle leaning against the bumper. He was reading a comic book. He looked up at the 50 German soldiers, waved a hand toward the field, and went back to reading. There were no fences here. There were no dogs. There were only trees and the horizon. Hans looked at Carl. "We could run," Hans whispered, "right now into the woods." Carl looked at the guard, then at the endless landscape stretching out in every direction. He looked at the cooler full of iced tea the farmer had left for them. "Run where?" Carl asked. "Back to Germany. It is 5,000 miles that way, and between us and home is an ocean owned by the American Navy." Carl picked up a hoe and started walking toward the cotton rows. "Besides," Carl said, "lunch is in 4 hours, and I hear they are serving ham." Hans hesitated. He looked at the woods. He looked at the guard who wasn't watching. And then, for the first time since Tunisia, he lowered his shoulders. He picked up a tool and followed Carl. He was beginning to understand that the fences in America weren't made of wire. They were made of geography and, strangely, of plenty. But the real shock, the moment that would fundamentally break his understanding of the enemy, was yet to come. It would come when the work was done, and the farmer invited them not back to the truck, but to his porch. By the summer of 1943, Hans Müller had stopped looking for the trap. For the first few weeks at the camp in Mississippi, he had eaten the white bread with suspicion, waiting for the interrogation, the beatings, or the forced labor that would break his back. But the blow never came. Instead, the only thing that was breaking was his worldview. The camp was not a dungeon. It was a small, bizarrely functioning German town transplanting into the American South. The prisoners, left largely to govern themselves inside the wire, had organized orchestras, soccer leagues, and theater troupes. They printed their own newspaper. They brewed illicit schnapps from potato peelings and sugar saved from the mess hall. But the true surrealism happened outside the gate. Every morning the trucks lined up. The shortage of American labor was acute. With millions of young American men overseas fighting the Wehrmacht and the Imperial Japanese Army, the harvest was rotting in the fields. The U.S. government had devised a pragmatic solution. The prisoners would save the crops. Hans was assigned to a detail harvesting corn and peanuts. The routine became clockwork. Roll call, breakfast, eggs, bacon, coffee, always real coffee, truck ride, field. One Tuesday in July, the heat was oppressive, a wet blanket of humidity that reminded Hans of the worst days in Tunisia, minus the flies and the dysentery. The guard assigned to their detail was a corporal named Müller, a man who shared Hans's surname but none of his ideology. Müller was a farmer from Iowa who had been deemed too old for frontline combat. Around noon, the heat became dangerous. Müller, sweating through his shirt, waved the 12 German prisoners toward the shade of a large oak tree at the edge of the field. "Take 5, Müller grunted, lighting a cigarette. Hans sat in the grass, drinking from his canteen. He looked at Müller. The American's Thompson submachine gun was leaning against the tree, out of arm's reach. Miller's eyes were closed. He was dozing. Hans looked at his comrade Karl. "He is sleeping," Hans whispered in German. "We could take the gun." Karl took a bite of a ham sandwich provided by the farm owner. "And then what? We shoot Müller, a man who gave you a cigarette 10 minutes ago. Then we drive the truck to—" "Where?" "Mexico. You don't speak Spanish. You barely speak English." Karl gestured to the open field. "Besides, look." A few hundred yards away, another prisoner had stood up. He walked over to Müller, who cracked one eye open. The prisoner pointed toward a creek that ran through the woods nearby. He made a swimming motion. Müller looked at the prisoner, looked at the heat shimmering off the road, and shrugged. "Yeah, go ahead. Just be back in an hour." Hans watched in disbelief as the German soldier walked into the American woods, alone, to go for a swim. "He will escape," Hans said. "He will be back," Karl replied. "The water is cool, the barracks have showers, and tonight is movie night. Why would he leave?" Karl was right. An hour later, the prisoner returned, hair wet, looking refreshed. He picked up his hoe and went back to work. This was the honor system, a uniquely American concept that baffled the Wehrmacht mindset. The Americans operated on the assumption that if you treated a man decently, he wouldn't act like a desperate animal. And for 99% of the prisoners, it worked. The escape rate for German POWs in the U.S. was less than 1%. It was lower than the escape rate for American federal prisons. But the walls of the cage weren't just physical, they were psychological, and they were about to be tested by the local hospitality. The farmer who owned the land was a man named Mr. Henderson. He was a devout Baptist who had lost a nephew at Guadalcanal. By all logic, he should have hated the men in field gray working his land. But Henderson saw them not as the Huns from the propaganda posters, but as young men who knew how to work a plow. At the end of the harvest week, Henderson approached the group. He pointed at Hans and 3 others. "You boys," Henderson said, "dinner inside." Hans froze. Fraternization was technically discouraged, though rarely enforced, but entering an American home, that felt like crossing a line. They washed up at the pump and walked timidly to the back porch. Henderson's wife had set a table: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, collard greens, cornbread, and iced tea. Hans sat at the table, his hands resting on his knees, terrified of making a mistake. He looked at the family. There were 2 small children staring at him with wide eyes. "Eat," Mrs. Henderson said, pushing a bowl of potatoes toward him. Hans took a bite. It was hot, rich, and tasted like home, not his home in Berlin, but the home he had imagined in his dreams. "Where are you from, son?" Mr. Henderson asked. Hans struggled with his English. Berlin, sir. My brother was in the Great War, Henderson said, chewing a chicken leg. Said it was a beautiful city. It was, Hans said, a lump forming in his throat. He knew what the RAF and the U.S. 8th Air Force were doing to Berlin. He knew his parents were huddled in cellars while the city burned. And here he was, eating fried chicken in the house of the enemy who was dropping the bombs. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. It is easy to kill a monster. It is easy to hate a faceless oppressor. It is very difficult to hate people who invite you to dinner while your own government tells you they are gangsters. Thank you, Hans whispered. Don't mention it, Henderson said. You worked hard today. A man works, a man eats. That's how it works here. This interaction was happening all over the United States. In Texas, POWs helped locals fix their tractors. In Minnesota, they helped bring in the lumber. In some towns, prisoners were even allowed to go into town on Saturday afternoons, unsupervised, to buy beer at the local tavern with the scrip money they earned, 80 cents a day. Imagine the scene. It is 1944. The Battle of the Bulge is raging. American GIs are dying in the snow of the Ardennes. And in a small bar in Alabama, a group of German soldiers is sitting in a booth, drinking Budweiser, listening to the jukebox and flirting with the waitress. It was a theater of the absurd. But inside the camps, a darker play was being performed. Not everyone was seduced by the white bread and the kindness. Inside the barracks, the hierarchy of the Third Reich had not dissolved. It had hardened. The officers and NCOs, non-commissioned officers, maintained strict discipline, and among them were the hardliners, the ardent Nazis, the SS men who had been captured, the true believers who viewed the comfort of the American camps as a dangerous seduction. One evening, Hans returned to the barracks after his shift. The mood was tense. The friendly chatter was gone. In the corner of the room stood Feldwebel Sergeant Braun. Braun was a towering man with a scar running down his jawline. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front before being transferred to Afrika. He didn't look at the American guards with curiosity. He looked at them with contempt. Müller, Braun barked. Hans snapped to attention. Jowl Herr Feldwebel. I saw you today, Braun said, his voice low and dangerous. Laughing with the Americans, eating their food like a dog begging for scraps. I was just eating Feldwebel, Hans stammered. Braun stepped closer. The room was silent. 50 men watched. You are a German soldier, Braun hissed. You do not fraternize with the enemy. You do not forget who you are. The war is not over just because you have a full belly. Braun turned to address the room. Listen to me. The Führer has not abandoned us. We are simply a deployed force behind enemy lines. We must maintain our discipline. Anyone who betrays the fatherland by cooperating too much, by giving information, by becoming Americans, will answer for it. He let the threat hang in the air. We have ways of handling traitors, even here. Hans felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He knew what Braun meant. Rumors had been circulating through the camp grapevine. In other camps, Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners had been found dead. They called them Holy Ghost suicides. A prisoner would be found hanging in the shower or beaten to death with a sock filled with rocks. The American guards would investigate, but the German prisoners would say nothing. The Kangaroo Courts were in session. The Nazi hardliners were conducting trials at night, sentencing traitors to death for disloyalty. The Americans were naive. They thought they were running a prison camp. They didn't realize they were hosting a civil war. That night Hans lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the crickets of Mississippi chirped in the humid darkness. He was safe from the bombs. He was well fed. He had money in his pocket. But he realized with a growing dread that the most dangerous place in America wasn't the guard tower or the town beyond the fence. The danger was in the bunk next to him. The golden cage had a lock, but the monster was locked inside with them. And as the news from Europe got worse for Germany, as D-Day approached and the Third Reich began to crumble, the desperation of the hardliners would only grow. Hans closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He listened to the breathing of the men around him, wondering which one of them would report him for the crime of eating fried chicken with an enemy who treated him like a human being. By 1944, the American South was sweltering and the war in Europe was turning. The Allies had landed at Normandy. The Red Army was smashing through Poland. The Thousand-Year Reich was burning. But inside the barracks of Camp Aliceville, the Reich was not only alive, it was fighting for its life. To the American guards watching from the perimeter, the camp looked peaceful. The prisoners marched to breakfast, played soccer in the afternoon, and tended their victory gardens. But Hans Müller knew the truth. When the lights went out, the camp ceased to be American territory and became a sovereign enclave of Nazi Germany. The Americans had made a critical mistake in the administration of the POW program. Overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners, eventually totaling nearly 400,000, they had delegated internal discipline to the German non-commissioned officers, NCOs. It was a pragmatic decision to save manpower, but it meant that the very men who had fanatically led squads in Tunisia and Italy were now the undisputed warlords of the barracks. Feldwebel Braun and his circle of loyalists had established a camp Gestapo. They controlled the mail. They controlled the camp newspaper. They controlled who got the best bunks and who got the extra soap. And most dangerously, they controlled the narrative. When the camp loudspeakers announced the fall of Cherbourg or the liberation of Paris, Braun's men would circulate through the barracks whispering that it was Allied lies. Propaganda, they sneered. The Führer is luring them into a trap. The secret weapons are coming. The V2s will erase London. For men like Hans, who had seen the endless lines of American tanks and aircraft factories on the train ride over, these lies were exhausting. He knew the war was lost. He just wanted to survive it, but survival was becoming complicated. The tension broke on a humid night in September. The target was not Hans, but a young soldier named Werner. Werner was 19, a quiet boy from Hamburg who had been drafted late in the African campaign. He spoke fluent English, having had an American mother who moved back to Germany before the war. Because of this, the Americans often used him as an informal translator during work details. Werner liked the Americans. He traded jokes with the guards. He read Life magazine openly in the barracks, marveling at the pictures of Detroit car factories. To Feldwebel Braun, Werner wasn't just a soldier, he was a cancer. It began at 2 hours. Hans was asleep when a hand shook him awake. "Get up," a voice hissed. "Court is in session." Hans sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The barracks were dark, lit only by a single candle at the far end of the room. Shadows danced on the wooden walls. The windows had been covered with blankets to prevent the searchlights from catching the movement inside. 50 men stood in a circle. In the center, shivering in his underwear, was Werner. Feldwebel Braun sat on a footlocker like a judge on a bench. Beside him stood 2 enforcers, huge men who had served in the SS before being shuffled into regular Wehrmacht units as the war desperation grew. "Werner," Braun said, his voice calm, almost fatherly, You are accused of treason against the Third Reich." "I did nothing," Werner whispered, his voice trembling. "I just translated for the farmer." "You were seen laughing with them," Braun said. "You were seen reading their filth. You have been spreading defeatist lies about the war situation." Braun stood up. He held up a piece of paper. "We found this in your footlocker, a letter you were writing to your aunt in Brooklyn. In it, you said that Germany has lost and that you hope to stay in America after the war." A gasp went through the circle. To say the war was lost was a crime punishable by death in Germany. The hardliners believed that law applied here, too. "That is treason," Braun said. "This is America," Werner pleaded, looking around the circle for help. He locked eyes with hands. "We are safe here. The war is over for us." "The war is never over," Braun snapped. "A German soldier fights until he dies. If he cannot fight with a rifle, he fights with his loyalty." The trial lasted 10 minutes. There was no defense attorney. There was no jury, only the nodding heads of the fanatics and the terrified silence of the moderates. "Guilty," Braun pronounced. Hans wanted to scream. He wanted to run to the door and bang on it, to call the American guards who were patrolling just 50 yards away with shotguns and dogs. They could stop this. They could save the boy. But he didn't move. He knew that if he ran to the door, the enforcers would stop him, and tomorrow night it will be him in the circle. The fear of the Holy Ghost was absolute. "We will not stain our hands with your blood," Braun said. "We are civilized men. You have a choice, Werner. You can redeem your honor." One of the enforcers stepped forward and placed a length of rope and a bucket on the floor. "Do it yourself," Braun said, "or we will do it for you, and it will be much more painful, and your family in Hamburg. We will ensure the Gestapo pays them a visit." The threat to the family was the final blow. Werner looked at the rope. He looked at the faces of his comrades, men he had shared rations with, men he had marched with. None of them moved. The collective cowardice of the group was a physical weight in the room. Werner picked up the rope. The next morning, the American guards found Werner hanging in the shower block. The official report listed it as suicide due to depression. The American camp commander, Colonel Roberts, was suspicious. It was the third suicide in 2 months. But when the investigators questioned the men of Barracks 4, they were met with a wall of silence. "He was sad about the news from home," Hans told the investigator, staring at his boots. "He missed his mother." Hans lied. He lied to protect himself. And as he watched Werner's body being loaded into the ambulance, something inside him broke. He realized that the Americans were naive. They thought that by removing the barbed wire from the fields and feeding the prisoners steak, they could civilize the Nazis. They didn't understand that the ideology wasn't a uniform you could take off. It was a virus, and it was thriving in the humidity of the Mississippi Delta. But the Americans were starting to wake up. The violence in the camps was becoming a national scandal. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a prisoner named Johannes Kunz had been beaten to death by his fellow POWs for providing information to the Americans. In Camp Papago Park, Arizona, a U-boat commander had orchestrated a massive tunnel escape. The happy prisoner narrative was cracking. 2 weeks after Werner's death, the routine changed. The prisoners were called to assembly, but this time they weren't being sent to the fields. They were herded into the camp theater. Colonel Roberts stood on the stage. He looked furious. Behind him sat a row of men in civilian suits, professors, psychologists, intelligence officers. "The party is over," Roberts announced. "We know what is happening in the barracks. We know about the Kangaroo Courts. We know about the intimidation." He pointed to the men in suits. This is the new program. You call it re-education. We call it denazification. From now on, you will watch films. You will attend lectures. You will see what your government has actually done to Europe. The lights went down. The projector whirred to life. On the screen, grainy black and white footage began to play. It wasn't American propaganda. It was raw footage from the Eastern Front. It showed the mass graves. It showed the Einsatzgruppen execution squads. And then, it showed the first images coming out of a place called Majdanek, a concentration camp the Soviets had just liberated. The silence in the theater was different from the silence in the barracks. It was a vacuum. Hans watched the screen. He saw the piles of shoes, the skeletons. Lies, a voice shouted from the back. It was Feldwebel Braun. Hollywood tricks, wax models. Shut up, Colonel Roberts roared into the microphone. Sit down and watch. For the first time, Braun's authority flickered. The men didn't rally behind him. They were glued to the screen. Hans felt a nausea rising in his throat. He had fought in Afrika. It was a clean war there, tanks against tanks in the desert. He knew nothing of this. Or did he? Had he chosen not to know? The film ended. The lights came up. The men looked pale. You will discuss this, the colonel said. And we are separating you. The NCOs are being moved to a separate compound. The hardliners are being sent to Camp Alva. Camp Alva, Oklahoma, the camp for troublemakers. The Americans had finally realized they needed a maximum security prison for the true believers. That night the MPs came for Braun. He didn't go quietly. He shouted about the fatherland, about betrayal, about the final victory. But as he was dragged out of the barracks, Hans saw something he hadn't seen before. The other prisoners weren't looking at Braun with fear. They were looking at him with exhaustion. The spell was breaking. The dual reality of the camp, the freedom of the day and the terror of the night, was collapsing. The Americans were finally asserting control. But for Hans, the internal war was just beginning. The film had planted a seed of horror. He had spent years telling himself he was a soldier fighting for his country. Now, he had to ask himself if he had been a soldier fighting for that. And as the harvest season ended and the winter of 1944 approached, a new question emerged. The war would end eventually. Germany would lose. And then, Hans and the 370,000 other prisoners would have to go home. They would have to go back to the rubble. They would have to face the women and children who had survived the bombings. And they would have to explain how they had spent the war eating fried chicken and playing soccer in America while their country burned for a lie. The golden cage was about to open, but Hans wasn't sure he wanted to leave. May 8, 1945 was a Tuesday. In New York, Times Square was a sea of confetti and kissing strangers. In London, the church bells were ringing for the first time in 6 years. But in Camp Aliceville, there was only silence. The camp commander announced the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich over the loudspeakers at 9 hours. There was no cheering in the barracks. Men sat on their bunks, heads in their hands. Some wept openly, not for the Nazi Party, but for the realization that their country had ceased to exist. They were no longer soldiers of a great power. They were men without a nation. Hans Müller walked to the perimeter fence. For 2 years he had looked through this wire at the American woods, dreaming of home. Now he could go home, but the reports coming from the new arrivals, prisoners captured in the Battle of the Bulge, painted a picture of an apocalypse. Berlin was a moonscape of craters. Hamburg was ash. Dresden was glass. "What are we going back to?" Karl asked, standing beside him. Karl had aged 10 years in the last 2. There are no jobs, there are no houses, there is no food. He looked at the American flag snapping in the breeze above the command post. "We are better off in the cage." The end of the war brought a bitter change to the camp atmosphere. The golden cage began to rust. The American public, now seeing the full footage of the Holocaust in newsreels, lost their patience with coddling German prisoners. The rations were cut. The friendly chats with guards ceased. The fraternization that had defined Hans's existence was replaced by a cold, bureaucratic process of repatriation. But the Americans didn't send them home. Not yet. In a cruel twist of logistics and politics, the United States delayed the return of the POWs. There was a labor shortage in Europe, and the Allies decided that German prisoners should help rebuild what they had destroyed. In early 1946, nearly a year after the war ended, Hans was finally loaded onto a train. He wasn't told his destination. He hoped for Germany. Instead, he was shipped to France. For 6 months, Hans worked in a French labor battalion near Verdun. The treatment was harsh, a stark contrast to the Mississippi farm. The French guards were angry, vengeful, and hungry themselves. Hans dug ditches, cleared minefields, and moved rubble. He lost the weight he had gained in America. The memory of Mrs. Henderson's fried chicken felt like a hallucination. Finally, in the autumn of 1946, the order came: release. Hans boarded a train for Berlin. The journey was a slow crawl through a shattered continent. Bridges were down, tracks were twisted, but nothing prepared him for the arrival. The train pulled into what was left of the Leiter Bahnhof. The glass roof was gone. The steel girders were twisted like pretzels. Hans stepped onto the platform, carrying his pitiful duffel bag, containing a few packs of American cigarettes, a bar of soap, and a pair of sturdy work boots he had saved from the camp. He walked out into the city. It wasn't a city. It was a graveyard of masonry. The smell was the first thing that hit him: wet ash, sewage, and the sickly sweet scent of bodies still buried deep under the rubble. Women, the Trümmerfrauen rubble women, formed human chains, passing bricks one by one to clear the streets. They were gray, dusty, and skeletal. Hans felt a surge of shame. He was tanned. He was muscular. He had spent the war harvesting peanuts in the sunshine while his mother had been eating tulip bulbs to survive the winter. He found his parents' apartment building in the Charlottenburg district. Half of it was sheared away, exposing the wallpaper of the bedrooms to the open air, but the ground floor was intact. He knocked, the door opened. His mother stood there. She looked 20 years older. Her eyes were hollow. She stared at him for a long moment, unable to reconcile this healthy, vibrant man with the son she thought was dead. "Hans," she whispered. He collapsed into her arms. He cried like a child. He cried for Werner, for the wasted years, for the destruction of his home, and for the guilt of his own survival. That night they sat around a small stove burning scavenged wood. Hans opened his bag. He took out the soap. He took out the cigarettes. These items were more valuable than gold in 1946 Berlin. The cigarettes could be traded on the black market for butter, for coal, for medicine. "Where were you?" his father asked, staring at the American cigarettes. "We heard the Americans were monsters. We heard they had death camps in the desert." Hans shook his head. "No," he said softly. "They gave me a job, they let me go for walks, they invited me to dinner." He told them about Mr. Henderson. He told them about the cotton fields. He told them about the lights of New York City. His father listened in silence, struggling to understand. The propaganda had been so absolute, the hatred so deep. How could the enemy be human? "They defeated us," Hans said, looking at the cracked walls of their home. "Not just with tanks. They defeated us because they didn't have to be like us." The years passed. Germany rebuilt itself. The Wirtschaftswunder economic miracle rose from the ashes. Hans found work in construction, helping to rebuild the city he had watched burn from afar. He married. He had children. But he never forgot Mississippi. In the 1970s and 80s, a strange phenomenon began to happen in small towns across Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi. Old men, speaking with heavy German accents, began to show up at local diners and motels. They weren't tourists. They were pilgrims. Hans Müller returned to America in 1978. He was 57 years old. He flew into Atlanta and rented a car. He drove west, retracing the route of the train that had carried him into captivity 35 years earlier. He found the town. It had changed. There were fast food restaurants now and paved roads, but the oak trees were the same. He found the Henderson farm. Mr. Henderson had passed away, but his son, now a man in his 50s, was running the place. Hans pulled his rental car into the driveway. He got out, his heart racing. Would they remember him? Would they chase him away? The screen door opened. The younger Henderson stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Hans. He squinted. "Hans?" the farmer asked. "It's me," Hans said. The farmer smiled, a wide, genuine American smile. "Well, I'll be damned. Come on in. The iced tea is fresh." They sat on the same porch where Hans had eaten that first terrified meal. They talked for hours. They didn't talk about the war or the Nazis or politics. They talked about corn. They talked about the weather. They talked about their grandchildren. Hans visited the site of the camp. The barracks were gone, dismantled for lumber decades ago. The guard towers were overgrown with kudzu. Only the concrete foundations remained, ghosts in the tall grass. He stood on the concrete slab where Barracks 4 used to be. He thought of Werner. He thought of Feldwebel Braun, who had died bitter and angry in a prison cell. And he thought of the American guard who had let them go swimming in the creek. The experiment of the fence-free camps had been a risk. It had terrified the American public. But it had achieved something that bullets never could. It had killed the ideology without killing the men. When the German prisoners returned home, they didn't carry hatred for America. They carried memories of kindness. They became the bedrock of the new West Germany, the staunchest allies the United States had in the Cold War. They had seen the enemy up close, and they had seen that the enemy was just a farmer who wanted his corn harvested before the rain. Hans Müller died in 2003. Among his possessions, his family found a small wooden box. Inside was his iron cross from North Africa, but next to it, wrapped in tissue paper, was a faded photograph from 1944. It showed a group of young men in Wehrmacht uniforms, standing in a peanut field in Mississippi, squinting in the sun. They were holding hoes, not rifles, and for the first time in the history of their war, they were smiling. The caption on the back, written in Hans's neat handwriting, read simply, "The time we were human again." If this story surprised you, if you didn't know that thousands of German soldiers spent the war harvesting crops in the American heartland, please hit that like button. It helps us preserve these forgotten chapters of history. And if you have a family story about the POW camps, whether your grandfather was a guard, a farmer, or a prisoner, drop it in the comments below. We read every single one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.